Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for June 2nd, 2022. Yesterday it was announced by Joe Biden that the United States will be sending advanced rocket systems to Ukraine with a range of up to 50 miles. The White House spokesman said in talking about this, quote, "We're not encouraging or enabling Ukraine to strike beyond its borders," unquote, which certainly is a concern for Russia. But this is part of the new package that was just voted up of $40 billion in new funding for Ukraine. That means the total now is at $54 billion since February 24th, just a few months. Keep in mind, Russia's annual defense budget is $65.9 billion. Now, this includes initially some small payments. And on February 26th, $350 million, another $800 million on March 16th. In March and April and May, a total of $13.6 billion. But then the big package, the $40 billion, which Biden asked for 33, but the Congress jacked it up to 40. That means now that the U.S. has provided $54 billion since February 24th. To Ukraine. Now, in the meantime, Biden wrote in a New York Times op-ed that the U.S. will continue to provide Ukraine with weapons, advanced weapon systems, as well as billions more in financial assistance. But he said, quote, "We do not want to prolong the war just to inflict pain on Russia," unquote. Well, that contradicts what Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said at Ramstein Air Base when he said our goal is to inflict pain on Russia. The White House also said that there are assurances from the Zelensky government that there will be no strikes in Russia. Now, the Russians said you can't trust Zelensky. When he ran for president, he promised to fulfill the Minsk Accords and seek peace with the Russian-speaking population in the Donbass, which he never did, largely because of the threats against him if he did so, coming from the extreme right-wing neo-Nazi networks inside Ukraine. Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov said that sending these weapons will delay the ending of the war. Then we have from Blinken, in an interview with Foreign Policy magazine, the U.S. Secretary of State, what are our two goals now? One, free Europe from dependence on Russia. So instead, make it dependent on the United States. Secondly, to send a signal to China. So what we're seeing is a war policy which is not just for 30 days, 60 days, a couple of months, but a permanent war policy dictated by the military-industrial complex, carried out through people such as Blinken, Boris Johnson, President Biden, and so on. Meanwhile, President Zelensky did an interview with Newsmax, and maybe he's beginning to believe the Western press proclaiming that he's all but the Messiah. He said, quote, "We are your defense perimeter." And then he said, "God is on our side." And he also said, "We have to realize who is the dark power. It is Russia." So we're seeing the ground being laid for continuous warfare, which threatens to erupt beyond Ukraine, including direct confrontation between NATO and Russia and the U.S. and Russia. And this is the most immediate danger that must be addressed. Now, at the same time, we're seeing the complete idiocy of the U.S. economic policy to try and contain China. Most recent was when Joe Biden went to Asia to promote the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, his Asia policy, the IPEF. It's now being denounced by many in Asia, even though the United States said it was warmly received. Former Malaysian President Dr. Mahathir, who's a very influential figure in Asia, said this is not an economic grouping, the IPEF, but a political policy against China, and it won't work. Indonesia's leading newspaper, the Jakarta Post, had an op-ed by its managing editor named Purba. And the headline was, "Biden's new trade pact offer is almost a laughingstock," unquote. And it said that the IPEF was, quote, probably born dead, unquote. Now keep in mind, Indonesia has a population of over 273 million people. And Indonesia was one of the former leaders of the non-aligned movement and is very much part of that today. That is, those nations of the Southern Hemisphere who are not supporting the U.S. sanctions against Russia and so on. Then we have from Little Cambodia, an article by a leading policy analyst, Dr. Seun Sam, which was published in the Khmer Times, which mocks the United States. It says the U.S. claims it wishes to strengthen ASEAN. By U.S., it means the Biden administration. They offer $150 million in aid to do that. Then he writes, China offered $1.5 billion, so China's offer was 10 times larger. But he said, meanwhile, the U.S. offers $150 million in aid while sending $40 billion for the war in Ukraine. So that can give you a sense of what's being discussed in the global South. A rejection of the global Britain, a rejection of the U.S. as a unipolar order. And these are countries that are looking to China and Russia for economic development, economic assistance as a counterpole to the collapsing Western financial system. So don't be so shocked when you hear that most of the world is not behind the U.S. war. The U.S. media is trying to convince you that every nation has agreed to go along with Washington, London, and Brussels. It's just not true. The unipolar order is on its deathbed. And the question is, will it bring the rest of the world to death, or can we establish a new security and financial architecture, which is what the Schiller Institute is involved in mobilizing for? Now, just to complete the picture of the economic side of things, we have a word from J.P. Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon. Remember, J.P. Morgan Chase is one of the owners of the New York Federal Reserve, one of the leading forces behind the financial pump priming known as quantitative easing. It's one of the largest derivative dealers in the world with a huge portfolio. Here's what Jamie Dimon said. His word on the economy is hurricane. He said, I see a hurricane coming our way. We just don't know if it will be a minor one or a superstorm. And Dimon then warned you, you'd better brace yourself. So that's from the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase. Then we had the odd occasion of Janet Yellen, former Federal Reserve Chairman, now Biden's Treasury Secretary, on CNN admitting that, quote, she misjudged the threat of inflation, unquote, when she said it would be, quote, manageable and a small risk, unquote. That from Janet Yellen. Remember, Jerome Powell, who was her successor as chairman of the Federal Reserve, spoke of transitory inflation. In other words, that it would be short term. So the two leading policymakers for the United States, by virtue of their presence as chairman of the Fed, Yellen and then Powell, who were largely responsible for continuing the policy of quantitative easing. In other words, a bailout policy of the biggest banks to bail out the bankrupt corporations and so on, in order to keep the bubble going, the everything bubble going. So the two of them were a major cause of inflation, the last two Fed chairs. Now Yellen is admitting she was wrong. Powell has yet to admit that. What did Joe Biden say after his meeting with Jerome Powell 2 days ago? He said, the first thing I've learned is respect the Fed's independence, unquote. That's the worst thing Biden could possibly have said about the economy. The Federal Reserve is not independent. It's a captive of the private banks that own it and the financial corporations that own it. And their interest is not with the health of Main Street America, not with the interest of the average American, not with your interest, unless you're a mega speculator involved in derivatives. The Federal Reserve is trying to preserve a system of speculation, which is shutting down the physical economy of the United States. And that's why, in a moment of candor, Jamie Dimon admitted that he sees a hurricane coming. To brace yourself, don't go into a basement. stay with us. Watch the Schiller Institute, watch the LaRouche Organization, and register for our June 18th, June 19th conference on how a bankruptcy reorganization of these institutions is what's necessary if we're going to solve the economic crisis. Thanks for joining me. Tomorrow's Friday. If you have some questions for me, send them to me at harleysch@gmail.com.